Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to go ahead and get us started. Thank you all for being here for this special event. My name is Sam Morey. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Policy Institute here at the University of Chicago. For those of you who don't know us, I'll just mention EPIC is an interdisciplinary research institute that unites faculty at the Harris School, the Booth School of Business, the Law School, the Economics Department, and the Physical Sciences Division in an effort that's committed to bringing new ideas to bear in solving the global energy challenge, which we define as the need to expand access to reliable, affordable energy while also dealing with the consequences, the related consequences of air pollution and climate change. In 2014, in recognition of the idea that the most important energy problems and the most urgent energy problems exist outside of the United States, EPIC launched a dedicated effort in India known as EPIC India, which is led by our country director, Anant Sudarshan, who you'll all be hearing from shortly. Now, over the past 2 years, our efforts in India have expanded and grown, and EPIC India now leads about a half dozen large-scale research projects throughout India in partnership with government, with the goal of identifying solutions to a wide range of problems, from energy access to air pollution. Earlier this year, we were excited to form a new partnership with a group called the Climate Parliament. Now, the Climate Parliament is a network of parliamentarians advocating for progress on climate policy around the world. This week, we've been the fortunate beneficiaries of that partnership. For the past several days, EPIC has hosted a group of distinguished members of Parliament for a series of exchanges, knowledge sharing, through an effort to showcase EPIC research. And as part of this, I think we've all had an incredible opportunity to get a better understanding of how our research in India can achieve real impact. Tomorrow, we'll continue the visit in Washington, D.C. So before we get into the program, I wanted to take a minute and introduce all of the parliamentarians visiting us this week to all of you now. So first we have Mr. Rakesh Singh from the BJP party. Mr. Singh is the most senior MP on this visit. He's the chief whip of the BJP in the Lok Sabha and chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Coal, Mining, and Steel. Next we have Mr. Vincent Pala from the National Congress Party. Mr. Pala is here, a senior member of a senior MP and a minister in the previous government. Next we have Ms. Vandana Shivan from the National Congress Party representing Maharashtra. Next we have Mr. Vivek Gupta from the All India Trinamool Congress representing West Bengal. He will be joining us soon. Next we have Dr. Sanjay Jaiswal from the BJP representing the Indian state of Bihar. Mr. Kalikesh Singh Deo from the Biju Janta Dal Party from Odisha. Dr. Prabhas Kumar Singh, also from the BJD Party representing Odisha. And lastly, Ms. Riti Pathak from the BJP representing Madhya Pradesh. So please just join me in welcoming all of our 8 guests. So to start our program off this afternoon, we first wanted to hear from Dr. Sanjay Jaiswal, who will offer some opening remarks. And I'll just introduce him. Dr. Jaiswal has been a member of Parliament from Bihar since 2014. He's currently serving his 2nd term in the 16th Lok Sabha. Presently, he is the convener of Climate Parliament in India. He's addressed several national, international dialogues on climate change, low carbon development, and clean energy initiatives. He's also participated in various dialogues defining India's strategy for successful implementation of the Paris Agreement. Dr. Jaiswal has undertaken several clean energy initiatives in his home state of Bihar. He's also been instrumental in getting major recommendations passed in the final reports of the Estimates Committee for increasing the budget of the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy to 1% of the total plan outlay today. He's also the co-author of a book, India, The Future Is Now. And so we're very excited to hear from Dr. Jaiswal.
Thank you, Sam. A very good afternoon to all of you. Dr. Michael Greenstone, colleagues from EPIC, and distinguished guests I stand proud today as one of the founding members of Climate Parliament. Back when in 2010, Climate Parliament was formulated as a multi-party network with a handful of like-minded, environmentally concerned members of Parliament. We were not really sure where and how far we would go with this network. Today, almost 7 years later, standing here and talking to the world's leading environmental and climate academics at the University of Chicago, I think Climate Parliament has achieved another milestone. I'm also quite pleasantly surprised with the interesting turn of events in the global energy and climate change scenes. The approach that we took in the last decade was mostly targeted towards safeguarding the rights of development of the developing countries. Today, these very countries have taken the baton from the developed countries and are playing a leadership role in advancing clean energy technologies. They have managed to strike the right balance between sustainability and development needs. Developing countries like India are making some great progress, but structural reformation in all sectors is critical need of the hour. Our complete energy infrastructure, both soft and hard, that is the great technologies and the system around it, is deeply locked into fossil-based fuels. While we are bullish on renewable energy, this dependence or locked-in infrastructure could result in renewable energy growth hitting a wall very soon. We are already seeing the repercussions with the renewable energy being cut off from the grids, coal power projects being run at subpar capacity and facing a loss. It is due to these structural factors, especially the need to maintain a base load in our grids, that our government still maintains that coal is going to remain our major source of energy. One of the immediate impacts of this dependence on fossil fuel-based infrastructure is the air pollution that we face in our Indian cities. Our dependence on car and other conventional transportation system and the inability to clean it at the core of urban air pollution.
Do you know how much gas
the impact of these, some of us have already faced in the past 1 month and will be facing during the winter session of the Parliament. Many of you who have the context of our urban transportation system will agree that only a radical overhaul of our transportation and energy system will lead to some results. But what will bring to this overhaul? According to me, it is innovation, not just technological, but also economic, social, and even political. Also innovation that is quick to deliver, scalable, and most importantly, that is locally and contextually embedded. This is where the role of research organizations like EPIC based in India is critical. Collaboration of Indian organizations with EPIC, where innovation and research expertise and capacities could be shared, will automatically lead to future positive domino effects. One economic innovation that can be particularly interesting, for instance, is the economic valuation of environmental services or well-being services like clean air, reduction in number of years, conservation of biodiversity, etc. Incorporation of these economic values in policy making can go a long way in making the right decisions. As for us policy makers, we have the most critical role to play. Our role is to let these innovations flourish and take shape. Our role is to realize the criticality of the situation and prioritize. Our role is to shun our myopia and short-term gains and choose the long-term sustainable solution. And what better way to educate a group of environmental champions like us to be the torch bearers ahead. To conclude, I would like to remember Lord Krishna's word during epic battle of Mahabharata, that the war between good and evil is going on, and history is not going to write the crimes of only those people who are on the evil side, but history will also write the crime of those people who remain neutral during this fight. I think you all of you have got a very larger role to save our Mother Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. I'm going to go ahead now and introduce our panel to continue the discussion. So first, we'll have joining us Mrs. Vandana Shavan. Mrs. Vandana is a member of parliament from Maharashtra, as I mentioned, serving in the Rajya Sabha, where she's a member of several committees, including the Committee on the Empowerment of Women and the Committee on Science, Technology, Environment, and Forests. She's a climate change crusader and also an author of the book, Green India, Clean India. She's participated in several climate change deliberations at the national and international level, including the Paris Climate Agreement. And she is also the funding president of ALERT, a network initiative to bring about dialogue between government, elected representatives, and citizens on climate change. So please join us at the front, and Mrs. Sivan will also offer some introductory remarks. But why don't I go ahead and introduce the full panel, and then we can start. So next is Mr. Kalikash Singh Deo. Mr. Kalikash is an elected member of Parliament for the second term as well, in the 16th Lok Sabha from Odisha. He spent his initial career working in investment banking and with the energy giant Enron here in the United States, as well as in India, before being elected to the State Legislative Assembly. He is a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Petroleum and Natural Gas. His development focus remains primarily on livelihood and climate change issues. He has actively participated as a speaker on various platforms to address a range of issues related to energy and climate, including being the speaker at the UN Peace Conference in Bangkok and the UN HIV/AIDS Conference in Bali. He's also led a group of parliamentarians to Nepal to meet with the new leadership for future bilateral relations. So please also join us here. Leading the discussion with these two distinguished members will be our own faculty director, Michael Greenstone, who is the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics here in the college, the Harris School, and am I forgetting one? The college and the Harris School?
Economics.
Economics. And also the faculty director of the Becker Friedman Institute, and then Anant Sudarshan, Epic India country director as well. So to start us off, Mrs. Sivan is just going to offer some framing remarks as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and let me take this opportunity to first of all thank you, Dr. Michael Greenstone, Sam, Vaibhav Chowdhury from the EPIC, our very own Climate Parliament. They are the ones who are responsible in getting us here. Mr. Mukul Sharma, Sumedha, and of course Anant. Thank you very much for hosting us here. It has been brilliant last 3 days interacting with a lot of people. I plan to take and of course I want to thank you all, because I believe there is a record registration of 100 people, 100 of you who have come here this afternoon to listen to what is happening back home in India. I plan to take an overview of how India looks at climate change and what are the different steps that we have taken in our own country. Well, climate change as a whole, we all know that it challenges the very existence of mankind. There were debates initially whether it is anthropogenic or whether it's just a matter of nature. But now experts have come to a finding, scientists have come to a finding that it is human interference is responsible for global warming. And therefore, it is time that we all wake up and try to do something in that direction. All over the world, there have been several impacts. In the US, on the North Pole and the South Pole, India has not been spared. India also has had its climate events like incessant rains, cloudbursts, rainfall, which is absolutely erratic. You must have heard a lot of suicides taking place in India. If you take some of the statistics, it is almost 59,000 suicides from 1980. We have to realize that 15% of the GDP in India comes from the agriculture sector. And a climate event or something going haywire would bring down our GDP by, it is predicted, 1.5%. So it is something that we have to be very concerned about. Not just this, there have been heat waves, cold waves. Heat waves in some cities, temperatures going to 50 degrees centigrade. I know you use the Fahrenheit measure here, but I don't know how much that would be in Fahrenheit. But 50 degrees centigrade. Cold waves also matter a lot, because we all know a 1 degree drop in temperature would mean it hits out to the agricultural produce like wheat or rice. And therefore, these are several factors which really are very concerning. India has a border coastline of 7,500 kilometers. And therefore, sea level rise is something that we are very concerned about. We already have lost an island called the Moor Island. I'm told there used to be a debate between Bangladesh and India whether Moor Island belongs to them or whether it belongs to us. But nature has taken its own course and just made it disappear. Same thing with the Lochara Island. It is no more existing. And several islands are facing this threat of extinction. Floods of rivers, receding of Himalayan glaciers, vector diseases. Chikungunya is a disease we had never ever heard of. There was bird flu, but never ever heard of chikungunya. But this is something which has taken India absolutely by a storm. Dengue and several other vector diseases which have impacted our civilization, our citizens. There are several invisible impacts which take place. People who get displaced, people who lose their livelihoods, fishermen who are absolutely vulnerable, staying on the coastlines. And if you have seen channels like Animal Planet or Discovery Channel, you see a lot of fishermen on television saying, or in the serials saying, oh, that's where my village used to be, and it's no more there. So each time there is some climate episode, they have to move inwards. And each time with the displacement, the children are also affected. So these are several ways that India is being impacted. I remember in 2005, I had an opportunity to go to Montreal for a conference where mayors from all over the world had converged. And so that is the time when it was for the first time that I'm sure the scientists and experts knew about it. But we as parliamentarians, I was not a parliamentarian then, but a people's representative, we as citizens in India did not know what the impacts were going to be. In 2005, there were the 3-day conference. From day one, 2 things were being said. One is US has not been a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. And second thing, which was being said by each and every speaker, was that the worst impacted or the most vulnerable countries in the world are going to be India and Bangladesh. And in the last 10 years, surely we see a lot of incidents which go to prove what they were absolutely saying. The good news is that India has always responded to international protocols and agreements. When there was a Stockholm conference, immediately we had an amendment made in the constitution which brought about environment protection as a fundamental duty and directive principle for the states to really act on that behalf. We had an Environment Protection Act which came into being in 1986. There was a Biodiversity Act which came into being in 2002. Earlier, the Indian Constitution talked about only how the central government and the state government, the judiciary, the executive and the legislature has to function. Never did it talk about the third tier of governance, which is the Panchayat Raj. But it was the 73rd and 74th Amendment, which was brought about close to 1992, in which it mandated that every local government, right from the city municipal corporation to the village panchayat, had to take environment protection or stop the environmental degradation as the topmost priority. So these were several measures which India has been taking on and off. You would be surprised to know that even the municipal corporations all over India are mandated to come out with an annual environment status report. This environment status report way back in 1992 used to be a 20-page document. Now it is a full-fledged 200, 300 pages document which makes an inventory of each and every city and says exactly what steps have to be taken. So these are the several steps that India has been taken. On the climate change front, the then Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh came out with Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. He formed something called the NAPCC, which is the National Action Plan for Climate Change. Along with this National Action Plan for Climate Change came 8 missions. I'm sorry, I think I missed out on moving this. So these are the missions. Yeah, these are the 8 missions. One is the National Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency, which obviously, I don't, they're all experts here, so I need not go into the details. Then there's a National Water Mission, National Solar Mission, National Mission for Green India, National Mission for Sustainable Habitats, National Mission for Sustaining Himalayan Ecosystems, and National Mission on Strategic Knowledge on Climate Change. And each of these missions have been assigned to a particular ministry. This happened way back in 2008. And since then, even the present government is giving it topmost priority to make sure that through every mission, the issue for the mission is addressed, and not only addressed, is taken to a proper logical end. Not only the National Action Plan for Climate Change, it has been mandated that every state in India will also have a state action plan on climate change. And not this, even the districts in every state would have a district plan on climate change. So this is the hierarchy that India has set up as a system, and plans to make sure that the carbon emissions and climate change issues are addressed. Paris Agreement, as you all know, which came into being in December 2015, India has played a stellar role in this direction. Being a developing country, India has made sure that we address two main issues, that is principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility, and also the respective capabilities of every country. The developing countries are not as capable, probably, on different fronts as a developed country. A USA cannot be compared to what technology or inputs can be achieved in India. And therefore, there has to be some differentiated responsibility between these two kind of countries. And therefore, this is the side which India kept harping. However, on the other side, the positive picture is that in spite of saying that developing countries have definitely to make sure that the developed countries take up their role, but on the other side, India has also come up with very, very ambitious national determined contributions. As you know, the Paris Agreement asked for every country to come up with its INDCs, the intended national determined contributions, which now become, of course, the NDCs. And in this, there are three major factors which India has come out with. Number one, reduce its GHG intensity by 40%, which is very ambitious, with 2005 as its baseline. Secondly, double its current renewable energy targets, which was 175 gigawatt by 2022. It has doubled it to 350 by 2030. And the third, increase a green cover to sequester 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That means plantation on about 20 million hectares of land. These are all very, very ambitious targets that we have committed to by 2030. In the meanwhile, as we all know that Paris Agreement the action commences from 2020. But in the meanwhile, India has also taken several steps to make sure that we have a disaster management plan, agroforestry programs, National Adaptation Fund, and several other factors which contribute to going on that pathway. However, with all this, we certainly have several challenges. And the challenges are, number one, there has to be a global political will. And this global political will, I think the US plays a very, very important part. It cannot be that few countries are trying to target and trying to bring down its emission when the others are not. We are amongst the first 5 emitters in the world, US being number 1, India being number 3. So I think all the major emitters in the world have to commit themselves, because it's not a question of just agreeing to something, it's a question of our future. It's a question of our children and grandchildren, and therefore it is something that we have to look into. Second, there has to be a balance, because on the one side, we have to make sure our developmental needs are catered to, and on the second side, of course, address the impacts. The third is the funds, because in the INDCs, if we have to achieve this, we need funds to the tune of US dollars 2.5 trillion. And this will, the world community will have to share their responsibility and make sure that India can achieve its targets. Last but one is technology. Technology is very advanced in developed countries, and therefore sharing of technology. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there is something already existing, I think it is time that we don't look at it as a commercial activity. We look at it as if we have to save our future. And if we have to save our future, technologies have to be shared and time must not be lost to reinvent. And last but not the least, which I always believe in, the national governments, the governments at all levels will be doing their work. What about us? What about you and me? What about us as individuals? I think all of us need to do our little bit and do our little bit at homes, office, and wherever possible. And if not, even pressurize our governments to make sure that they move in the right direction. Because we cannot lose the time. The time is now. We have to begin right now if we want to see a better future. Thank you very much.
Very good. Sorry?
We need to properly introduce you.
Okay. Thank you. Spoke very well.
Thank you. That was terrific.
Great. And so I want to welcome Mr. Kalakash now for some additional remarks before we go into the panel.
Okay. Thank you, Sam, and good afternoon to all of you. It's nice to see this room packed. I believe it doesn't happen very often. Must be the good food, you know. I hope you guys had a good meal. I'm going to keep my opening remarks very, very short. I think Vandana has conveyed to you what this group essentially stands for. It believes in battling climate change. It believes in pushing governments, both domestic and international, to commit to what we believe is the correct path forward, a sustainable path forward. The slide I've got on is a fairly encompassing, wholesome slide. It conveys to you the various factors which influence the energy mix of India. Since the largest part of India's commitment to climate change remains through the energy sector, I think it's important to understand a bit of what it comprises India's energy sector, the socio-economic obligations and influences that India has. And a lot of you may already know this. So if I'm repeating myself or I'm conveying something which is very simply out there, just let me know. India is a rich country, yes, it's one of the largest markets, but it also has some of the lowest per capita figures of $1,500 versus US's $53,000 per capita. It's got 300 million people living below the poverty line. And when I say below the poverty line, I'm talking about another 300 million people who live above the poverty line, but you wouldn't call them well off by any standards. High transmission losses, bad infrastructure to transport electricity, distribute electricity, the entire market distortion of states supplying free electricity over decades, people wanting electricity, not really being able to pay for it as much as we would like them to, or as much as the costs are, so some of them have to be subsidized by the government. Even then, electricity demand is going to go up. We are in the final stages of a scheme where we seek to electrify all households by 2022-23. The slide tells you there are almost 200 million people who are living without electricity now. Population is going to go up. Yes, there's been a big commitment from India of 175 gigawatts by 2022 and 350 gigawatts by 2030 to generate electricity from renewables. And these are, of course, installed capacities. So assuming that you have about a 20-22% plant load factor of it, or generation factor of it, it will be a major commitment. But yet, if you look at the last line below, even in 2040, renewables won't comprise a large part of the generated capacity because coal is still expected to go up. It is a thermal-based energy system at the moment. Coal is abundant, high ash content, low sulfur. That's the combination we have there. So the first question we would ask is, why don't we switch off coal completely? The strains on the economic conditions of people don't allow India to switch off coal completely. We need a baseline, base power. Gas is not easily available. I think India produces at the moment 25 billion cubic feet of gas. per annum, imports another 20 billion cubic feet of gas every year. Pipeline systems are not very well developed. Even at current low prices of gas on imported LNG, large number of gas-based power plants are lying shut or lying idle because the electricity boards are not buying power from them. The pricing is still too high as vis-a-vis compared to a pithead coal-based power plant, or even the latest figures of renewable generation, of solar generation at ₹2.34, the latest bid that we've got. This is broadly the picture that we have of the energy mix. So yes, we need to have a ramp up on the electrification. The key challenges before us is to how do we do it, keeping in mind the environment, the impact of climate change, and can we really manage to achieve the major goal of electrifying all the villages? I hope these questions come up in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those excellent opening remarks, and thank you for coming to the university and spending some time with us. It's been a tremendous honor, and we look forward to this just furthering our relationship into future exchanges. So we are lucky to have Anant Sudarshan here with us, and the two of you have covered, Vandana and Kalikesh have talked about climate change and energy, and I thought maybe Anant would talk a little bit about air pollution, and then we will cover the holy triangle of the global energy challenge and turn to some specific issues.
So I think, we all know that India has an air pollution problem. That's not news to anybody. What I think is interesting is why that arises and something about how we might solve it. So I think there are three things that I'd like to flag about in air pollution in India. The first is that the costs are extremely high. And we're beginning to learn that through some of the research in EPIC and through research both in India and in other places. The health costs from air pollution, the social costs of air pollution are extremely high, and they come mostly from off the energy mix. Certainly coal is by far the largest contributor. So the first question when we talk about costs is whether India can begin to integrate the social costs, the externalities from coal, into the way it thinks about pricing. And these are real costs. These are health costs that a different part of the government bears, a different sector sees. So it's not as if it's not real money being paid out. It's just that it's invisible in some ways to the energy sector. So the first question is, can we think of integrating those costs? The second question that I think is interesting is how would we get to lower levels of air pollution, particularly in the energy sector? So what's the problem? And I think a lot of EPIC research, and it's not just EPIC research from other places as well, seems to point to the fact that what's the problem in India is actually regulation and the economics of how we deal with air pollution. We actually have legislation and laws in place that are powerful, that allow for a range of policy solutions, but we've historically not been very good at translating them into regulatory instruments that actually work. So India has high compliance costs. The regulatory instruments that are in use impose very high costs on industry. And as a consequence, there's very low compliance. So if you look at what's on the books versus what is actually being emitted, in this case from the industrial sector, there's really no relationship between the two. And that's something that I think the country has to confront head on. And possibly to ask the question, if current regulation is not working, how do we change that? And that's something that, the legislative part of the government sort of maybe does not normally directly look at because you've made the laws. But I think it's critical that change because those laws are not being implemented in the best possible way. So I think those are two aspects of the air pollution problem that are important and interesting in India. The third is as a consequence of these two things. The narrative around air pollution tends to focus on a trade-off between environmental growth and air pollution. And I think that trade-off is possibly false. because you're, again, looking at regulation that's imposing costs that are much higher than they need to be. And so there are solutions out there that will lower costs and will improve environmental outcomes. And the idea is to use them. In the context of climate change, I think it's also important to remember that air pollution reduction has the nice characteristic that it also brings significant climate co-benefits, especially when that air pollution is coming from coal and from diesel. Those climate co-benefits are sometimes underplayed by India, both in talking about what the country is doing on the climate change front. If you look at our INDCs, they mention very little about air pollution policy, about local air pollutants. But if you do the math, the co-benefits are significant. And so there's another win-win hidden there. There's the opportunity to reduce health costs today and also make a significant contribution to reducing the carbon emissions of the country. So I just wanted to throw those three things out there.
I just want to underscore a little bit what you're saying. You've been a little mysterious about these policies that could be implemented. Do you have any particular in mind, or are you not at liberty to share them with us?
Well, so one of the questions is whether India can start using market-based instruments to regulate air pollution.
You think at the University of Chicago we believe in market-based instruments?
Yeah, at the University of Chicago we're very big on market-based instruments. So currently India has a command and control style of regulation. This actually dates back to sort of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, drawing heavily upon US regulatory tools at that point in time. It's not really changed since then. It's not really working. What's interesting is that if you look at India's INDCs, there's a lot of talk about market-based instruments. And then it's important to ask, if we are actually going to use these instruments, then we need to have pilots and we need to have regulatory experience with those instruments. So it's not just about, are these more effective ways of managing air pollution? I would argue they are. Certainly they need to be given a chance. But they're also necessary if we are going to use them in fulfilling the commitments that India has made at Paris. And so they are there on paper. But are those going to translate to the real world? Well, if they're going to do that, we need to start somewhere. And I would say air pollution is a great place to start because there are immediate benefits in the form of health impacts.
Okay, I wanted to follow up on Vandana's terrific presentation. And I think there's a question that's on the tip of the tongue of many people here. And I'll just set it up with, first of all, the figures. Emissions per capita, tons of CO2 in 2013, it was 16.4 for the US. In India, it was 1.9. So that's background, level set that. And now we've fast forwarded from, that was in 2013 to today. And the United States has a new president relative to when the Paris Accord came into play, who it can be difficult to figure out exactly what he is thinking at any moment in time, but he does not seem deeply committed to the Paris Agreement. And I wonder how that looks through the eyes of an Indian parliamentarian and how that might affect India's commitment to its own INDCs.
Well, globally, USA is always looked upon as the big brother, and you like to feel that you're the big brother also, just not. So in that
feelings
context,
are very important.
Feelings are the most important, and then in that context, I think definitely the world, not just India, but the world looks very with great. They want America to really take steps, or the president to take positive steps and make sure that we address this a very, very serious issue. And unfortunately, the US has been taking the back step. In fact, the Paris Agreement is one such agreement which is a landmark historical step probably that the world would be taking to address this issue. In fact, this is an opportunity for our generation to be called as heroes by the next generation, if at all we are able to make a difference and save Mother Earth. But unfortunately, if the biggest polluter on the globe is not going to be on the scene or in the entire process, then I think that is something which is absolutely not correct. There are the figures here, and I also have per capita emission figures. US 2012 figures, USA per capita is 16.4 4 tons per person, whereas India, 1.6 tons. And in spite of that, India has taken a leadership role. I think we expect a lot from the US, lot from the president, and I hope somebody is able to change his mind.
And so let me phrase it slightly different. So that's a complicated task that a lot of people are working on. But were the United States to take, let's say, a greater leadership role than whatever its current role in climate is, would that inspire India and other countries, do you think, to do more?
I'm 100% sure about that, because after all, USA, as I said, has been on the leadership roles on all fronts. And if America has to step in, certainly it will give a big fillip to all the other countries to make sure that they enhance their commitments and make sure that things would work.
Yep. Okay, Kalikesh, now the Prime Minister maybe a month ago made this terrific commitment that every household in India will be connected to the grid, maybe even by the end of next year?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And my question, given the transmission, you're filled with excellent facts and figures, we love numbers here, is with the transmission and distribution losses of, let's call them 23%, maybe they're higher in some places and lower in other places, will there be, how to ensure that there's electricity flowing through those connections, and not just a couple hours, but the kind of electricity that allows for heating, cooling, lighting, and all the things people want?
So being a member of the opposition, I'd say the Prime Minister made a commitment of providing connections and not electricity, right? No, but I think the government is serious in trying to provide some form of stable electricity. We have a huge grid upgradation effort which needs to be done to ensure that we have 24/7 electricity. That is, again, a promise of the government, a few years out in the future. I think there is some effort being done on the grid upgradation, including on trying to manage or make the grid smarter to absorb renewable energy, solar energy into the system. These are challenges. There's some amount of money and effort coming in there. I think a lot more needs to be done. I'm also going to just come into Vandana's question. You asked about whether India would be committed to the INDCs even if the US backed out. I think India's commitment will stand firm, irrespective of what happens globally. But I also think if US is not part of the solution, then will these efforts ever amount to anything? We also know that the Paris Protocol will not really achieve the goals that we set out to achieve. So if US, which is the largest emitter per capita and otherwise, will not be a part of the solution, but will be a part of the problem, then will the Paris Protocol amount to achieving anything? I think that's going to be a major question in people's minds.
Yeah. Anant, I wanted to turn back to you, since you're going to be waving the flag for markets left and right here, on this discussion of how we make sure that there really is electricity coming through the wires for all the connected households. There's no question that building infrastructure has got to be part of it, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what reforms you think might be useful in electricity markets in India, which I know is something you've worked on and are working on.
Yeah, so I think we at Chicago and definitely in EPIC, we tend to feel that the economics of these problems is both very important and sort of does not get enough attention. So let me talk about like one simple problem in getting people electricity, and that's the distribution sector. And the question is, electricity is a commodity. You cannot get electricity to people unless you can get them to pay for it. And so what we have in India is this curious situation where the government talks often about how we have surplus power. In other words, there's more power being generated than people are buying. And that's not really a good thing, because clearly India needs more electricity. So if there's more power being generated than is being bought and used, that's not a plus, that's a minus, and it indicates something is wrong. So some of our research currently is looking at what might be the problem and then what might be the solution. So we have this curious situation in India where electricity utilities are unable to collect what they are owed from consumers. And there's a variety of reasons for that. There are inefficiencies within the utility, and then there's a social norm in many parts of India that electricity is a right, that government supplied electricity is not something that you need to pay for. What's particularly fascinating is in many Indian villages, you have the same household paying, for example, a diesel generation private electricity provider, but not the government. So utilities are losing money every time they send electricity into the grid. And these are bankrupt entities. And so the response of electricity utilities is not to buy the power. And when they do buy the power, to send it to cities and to parts of the state or country that are actually paying for it. And there's this interesting story, we work in the state of Bihar, and while we were working there, an election was held. And during that election, the chief minister pushed for greater electricity supply. It's obviously an important part of winning an election. And what we saw was that there was absolutely no change in how much power the utilities bought, even as wholesale prices were dropping, because they were simply unable to get the money to buy power from anyone, because you know that you're going to lose money every time you buy a unit of power. And so that's entirely an economic problem. It's not solved by upgrading the grid. It's not solved by building a power plant. And so a lot of EPIC's work is looking at how you might change that. What are the incentives you might put in place on utility employees and for people to pay for the power that is sent to them? Because I do not think we will reach our goals of supplying electricity to households unless you can improve the recovery rates of utilities.
Okay, so now we can all agree markets are going to solve every single thing. But I think you did touch upon something that makes me a little nervous with my economist hat on, is like social norms. And where do they come from, and can they be altered? And I wondered if Kalkesh or Vandana would want to talk about that, the social norm that electricity should be a right.
Yeah,
Which sounds like it's a little bit hard to disagree with until Anant starts, belaboring the terrible statistics and that people don't pay and that the distribution companies are withholding supply because no one is paying. But at first pass, it sounds like a great idea.
Anant's absolutely right. On the state of economic affairs of the distribution company, and the fact that people are mostly not willing to pay, or they prefer not to pay. Yeah. Now, a bunch of things are being used by the distribution companies, at least in my state of Orissa, where to make people pay. But even then, a large number of complaints I get is, look, we can't pay the bill. Could you help us? Yeah. And I'm telling them, no, I can't help you, because you need to pay for the electricity. Essentially, this bad or not so nice social norm started with the common ailment of Indian politics. It's populist politics. We like to give a lot of doles, and a bunch of states have actually given out free electricity. And over the years, people are expecting free or subsidized electricity. I think that needs to change. I think state governments and I think this has been a part of the regulatory framework too now, that state governments who want to give free or subsidized electricity have to pay for it through their budgets. Even though their distribution companies may be absorbing the losses, I think this is something which needs to be built in sacrosanctly in the electricity distribution companies as well as in the other public sector units which exist. There's a lack of transparency in the way public sector companies work. And in many cases, even for Government of India as well as state governments, they end up absorbing a lot of the subsidy burden, which this is being used by different governments repeatedly over time. This is one thing which we need to change. The other thing we need to change is to ensure that the electricity which gets to people is stable. So I think a large number of people will want to pay for stable electricity, where they can run pumps on, where they can run machinery on, where they can have some sort of economic activity on. I think the problem is that people don't want to pay for electricity which comes for 2 hours and which is so weak that you can't start your pump for your irrigation system. So if we can improve the quality and lay down very strict transparency norms, where distribution companies work and where public sector companies work, I think that we'll fix a large part of the problem.
Yeah, I think Kalikesh has very well understood and conveyed the situation. Definitely there is a problem there. But I think if our systems and administration setup is put in place, it's not an impossible task. And I don't know, while Kalikesh and Anant were speaking, I was just thinking, in India now we are connecting everything to the Aadhaar card. So whether we could really connect this to the Aadhaar card, and just as we credit amount into a bank account, can we debit the amount to take away the I mean, this is just thinking aloud.
Yeah.
But I mean, some systems could be built. I don't think it's an impossible task.
Okay, now I know some of the students have class at 1:30. Some of them will feel committed to going. Those are the students who don't see the big picture. But in case some of them start to have to go, I thought we should open the floor as they're leaving for questions, because I know there are a lot of people interested in asking questions of our excellent panelists. Do we? I think we have roving microphones. So if you have a question, please state your name, and our panel will try to take it on.
Hi, thank you for coming here and sharing all the information and your perspectives on this issue with us. My name is Darshan. I'm a public policy student at U Chicago. My question is, what are the plans for from the Indian government or the local representatives to sort of get sort of civic engagement or people's contribution or participation, active participation in solving these issues, instead of government making the policies and then trying to implement them, and actually giving the power to people to sort of solve the local issues for themselves?
Very honestly, yes, the government does come up on its own proactively to make certain policies. But even on the other side, we have seen that a lot of voluntary organizations or like-minded people also come together to press upon the government to take certain steps. And there have been several instances, especially on the energy and power front, that people who have studied on these issues come forward to really make the government make some policies in that direction. So a lot of laws have in fact also come into play only because of the push from the voluntary organizations. We have a fabulous municipal solid waste handling and disposal law, and it came only as an outcome of a very active citizens from Bangalore who filed a writ petition in the court, and the Supreme Court gave a ruling, and the government had to make this legislation. So there is already a lot of people's participation. In fact, I think India is moving towards a direction where the government is becoming more and more open to dialogue with people. In fact, our present Prime Minister has an app on his name. He wants people's suggestions. He has dialogue with people. So I think there is a lot of positive picture as far as that is concerned. And on the other front, even at the local government level, we have people, certain policy decisions are taken only after taking people's participation and making sure that their suggestions and objections to a particular issue have been voiced, and only then the decisions are taken. So I think people's participation is coming in a very big way. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Corey. I'm also a public policy student here at Chicago. I believe there was mention of a finance gap in infrastructure investment to meet an energy transition. And I'm wondering what the role is of the Indian and international private sector in filling this gap, and what policies can be passed to crowd in this finance.
So let me address a part of that. I think a large part of this infrastructure is being financed by the Indian private sector. Pretty much, I mean, even with the 175 gigawatts target of solar that we have until 2022, we've achieved maybe, what, 60,000 megawatts so far? I'm guessing. So we're still way short of where we should have been. The government recognizes that. My conversation with the previous power minister, who's now become railway minister, that's another thing, they change all the time. But it is very clear that the solar needs to be supported to a certain extent, maybe by a reverse subsidy basis. So the government has market mechanisms, to make Anant happy, to ensure that Indian private sector participates more and more in the creation of renewable energy systems. What we fall short of, and what we have fallen short of, in my view, what is one of the biggest problems that we have currently in the Indian system, is that the banking sector don't conform to the requirements of the renewable sector. So banks lend for 10 years 7 to 10 years. India has one of the highest interest rates globally. And it becomes very difficult to put up large-scale, long-term infrastructure projects. I think that's one key element of reform that we need to bring in. The banks can lend for a longer period of time, get cheaper funds, access to maybe global funds, and ensure that funds are available to create such infrastructure.
Hi, my name is Herschel, and I'm an economics student here. As Michael probably knows all too well, there is like a political divide here in the States of sort of people that are in Congress, the belief in climate change or not, the belief that it's anthropogenic. And I feel like that prevents a lot of talk about instituting a carbon tax or market-based mechanisms here, let alone like actual policy change. And so it's a very strong political hurdle for sort of attacking these issues at their source. So I was wondering if you face similar hurdles in Indian government and how much that affects this.
You want to, should I? No, I think in terms of the action on climate change, the government of India has been fairly consistent, both with the previous UPA government as well as the current NDA government. In fact, the current NDA government has gone a step further and promised the 175 gigawatts, which is a very ambitious target for Indian renewable sector. So no, I mean, it's a commonly accepted fact in India, even down to the grassroots villages of India where people may not be as educated or not as aware or not exposed to international television, that climate change is going to pose a serious problem, that people living in India are going to be severely affected, that their livelihoods are going to be affected. You can see that happening now with the rains getting delayed, and since a large part of agriculture in India depends on irrigation, it's having a direct impact on people. So no, as long as the voters want you to take reasonable action on climate change, the governments will go ahead and do it. So I don't see any sense of divide on the issue of climate change.
No, I think you're being very polite. It's a form of American exceptionalism to deny the science.
But I was told a very interesting thing which is happening in America. Though the president or even earlier, the central government was not party to signing or even the Kyoto Protocol, but there were about 100 mayors of different cities who had taken upon themselves that we are going to bring down our carbon emissions in the cities. And if you go to see the action which has to happen, of course you need a central legislation and central policies, but the action which is to happen has to happen at the grassroots. And I think that's a classic example where more than 800 cities in the US, I don't know whether they are still pursuing their agenda, but at that time, this was about 7 years back, I was told by no less than the former Vice President Al Gore that it's 800 cities at that time who had committed themselves to bring down carbon emissions in their own cities. Even in Indian cities now, we are some of them are taking a proactive role to make a carbon inventory for their own city, to identify which are the sources where the carbon emissions take place, and they are targeting to bring it down at all levels. It could be transportation, it could be solid waste, it could be energy efficiency, we're trying to make it better, and several other fronts.
No, I actually think the city of Chicago is a leader and indeed is, I think, hosting a conference of cities on December 5th and 6th, I think, where cities are gathering to affirm their commitments on carbon. And indeed, I think that has kind of gained momentum in the last, let's say.
And I think it would be a classic example for cities to actually pressurize the president to move.
Okay, so here's a question. It might seem off topic, but I think it's related to this. Do the people get the government they want in the end?
The people get the government they deserve at the end. They vote for them. Yeah.
All right, that might be too broad. All right. We're going to leave that one alone. I think we have time for one last question. Or maybe two quick questions. How about that?
My name is Rao Kodamati. I work at Argonne National Lab, which is close by here. I work on air pollution, and one of the big things I find in New Delhi, for example, is there's a misidentification of actually what the sources are. I'm not saying it's completely wrong, but there are a lot of small-scale industries that pollute, and there is no regulations on them, like breaking bricks and metalworking and things like that. So I think that's a key problem. I mean, you have to find a way of addressing that. I know cars, whether you drive a diesel car or not, it seems like a big, fancy thing to do, but there are all these small polluters that actually are much bigger of a problem. And the second thing is microgrids. Why don't you think about microgrids? It's getting a lot of interest here. There's a lot of technology being developed, and that's a local solution. Like, you don't have a big...
So we've tried microgrids in India. It's been successful in some parts, but it's been plagued by the fact that, again, after a while, people didn't want to pay. So the guy who sets up the microgrid goes down. But I'd be interested to know your studies on the sources of pollution in Delhi or India, because we've got 4 reports which have come out, and all 4 reports have different figures on it. So it'd be great to know if you can identify what the sources are. Yeah, certainly we can act on it.
Yeah. There's also a politically tricky issue, and it's tough on the government around things like brick kilns. So Delhi banned industry within the city borders. The brick kilns, therefore, have moved just outside the city, sometimes 100 meters, 200 meters outside the city. So it makes very little difference from the point of view of air pollution. But it's then a difficult problem to solve. Suddenly you need coordination across states. Of course, brick kilns employ people and they're important. So I have a lot of sympathy for the government now and then previously over the last 10 years in trying to solve the problem of air pollution in Delhi. It's just an incredibly complicated problem to solve.
In fact, the crop burning is also another major issue. Crop burning, construction, particulate matters, heavy vehicles flying through the city at night. The ring roads which were to happen have not happened as yet. There are several factors, I think, which really contribute to the particulate matters in Delhi.
And that's why we have Anant and Epic there.
Yeah. Last question.
Hi, my name is Ananya. I'm a research assistant at Epic. Just a quick question.
Be careful, he's a double agent. He was working for the government of India recently, 3 months ago.
So that's actually related to my question. The chief economic advisor, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, made a fairly provocative speech a couple of months back where he said that a lot of these targets that India is committing to, the 175 gig by 2022, for instance, are at the backbone of highly subsidized renewables. And, so the government's trying to keep the cost of renewables artificially low. But at the same time, this has a direct impact on the coal sector. We spoke about sort of already low payload factors, and he estimates that if we meet 175 gig by 2022, it's actually going to go down further by 13 percentage points. And he thinks this is like a double whammy fiscally for the government, because on one hand you have these renewable subsidies, but on the other you have schemes like the Uday scheme, which is protecting the coal lobby and trying to buttress their financial problems. So how do you see this? I mean, he in fact provocatively said we should drastically reduce the subsidies on renewables, which a lot of people, of course, had issues with. But given that this is coming sort of from the core of the government, I was wondering what your views are on this take.
So let me just state that Arvind's views, and I've spoken to Arvind on this issue a few times before, they are not completely in consonant with the government. Thank God. Arvind, he's addressing an issue which remains, that if we drive in the current mix that we have of energy in India, if we drive the coal, the base load supply of coal out of business, then we don't have an alternative at the moment. And as I said before, we haven't got the gas to replace it as yet, not gas at that cost. My counter argument to Arvind would always be that, yes, there is some sort of subsidy to the solar and renewables as things stand today, but there's a lot more subsidy to fossil fuels in India. Even now, fossil fuels in India, the transportation is much cheaper, the kind of environment costs are not built in. We've just recently put a 400 rupee carbon tax, which is a fairly high number. It's almost a 60% number on the price of coal. So it's just been recent turn of events that the real cost of health and environment, not health as yet, but just environment, are starting to be put on fossil fuels. So if we were to remove subsidies, let's remove it from everything. Let's put the cost of health on it, And then if you do a comparison, I'm quite confident that renewable will still beat everybody. But the point is that can we count on renewables as a baseload in India? At this point in time, we are still struggling with that. We need to build a viable baseload, so nuclear could be an option to some extent. Gas would be a very easy option for us because we just have to replace a bunch of coal plants.
Okay, let me just express what a terrific panel this was, how wonderful it has been to have all of you, Mukul leading the charge here, have you visiting for the last few days, and I know this is going to go on for a few more days in Washington, and I'm sorry I cannot join, but it's really been our tremendous honor to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.